you want long responses, or do you want to keep them fairly
no,
short?
Let it go.
Just however long? Okay.
All
All right. Very good.
Okay, you can start at any time.
Okay. Well, everyone knows Al Capone as the greatest. Everyone knows Al Capone as the gangster, and many admire his leadership and style of gang management. What was Al Capone's gang management style?
You know, I think that when you look at Capone overall throughout his entire career, I think that the one legacy he left behind was he almost was a forerunner of the modern theory of business management that the Japanese employed so successfully for so many years. You can almost say that he was the first organization man, especially in the criminal underworld. Now, before Capone in Chicago, organized crime was pretty much a scattershot proposition. You had criminal elements who were confined into various neighborhoods, into areas of the city. You had gambling syndicates. Gambling was really the lifeblood of organized crime. It has been for really since its inception. Capone did not invent organized crime in Chicago, but what he did was he consolidated it, and he built and created a legacy that has forever cemented the reputation of the city of Chicago to what it is today. When you look at, and when you ask people who don't live in Chicago, give me a thought about the city of Chicago, and more often than not, a couple of things will come to mind. They may say Oprah Winfrey, they may say Michael Jordan, they may say the Cubs, they may say deep dish pizza, but on top of all that, they always say Al Capone, rat-a-tat-tat. And that's remarkable, given the fact that Capone was really only active in the city of Chicago for 12 years, 1919 to 1931. And if you parcel that 12 years and break it down to its parts, from 1925 to 1931, he was the boss of the city. That's really only 6 years this guy was active. So his legacy is extremely profound, and if you look at so-called organized crime as it exists today, apart from the traditional mafia and the outfit, as we call it, street gang leaders have adopted Capone's management style. You can almost draw organizational charts, and that's really what he created, was an organizational chart where you had bosses and sub-bosses and crew leaders. So really, to make the long story short, he streamlined and systematized crime in Chicago. And of course, he had the vehicle of national prohibition, which was the great impetus for it.
All right.
Okay, hold on. Okay, action.
Could you offer a comparison of Al Capone to other major gang leaders such as Larry Hoover or Jeff Fort?
You know, it's interesting when you talk about street gang leaders in modern day Chicago, and I guess by that term I mean since the 1950s. Jeff Fort studied the organizational model established by Capone, and it was often said that when Jeff Fort was organizing Woodlawn and getting the Blackstone Rangers together in the late 50s and early 1960s, he talked about that. That he was going to build an empire and have bosses and sub-bosses and street soldiers, patterning it after the so-called traditional mafia. But really, Capone was the first major national gangster of national renown. The system of mafia in the city of New York didn't really officially evolve until 1931, when they organized the five-family structure. Now, you had gangsters in New York operating in the 1900s and the 1910s, but none of them attained the status or national character of a guy like Capone. Was Capone a smart man? I don't think academically he was very bright, but he knew how to organize people. He knew how to get people to influence his will. And this was very true of Fort and Larry Hoover. Hoover once said that when he saw Fort, who was much older than him, walk into a church and how people separated and parted to make way for Fort, Hoover said, "I'm going to get me a mob like that someday." And they study each other, they copy each other, and they follow these patterns of organization. And when you break it right down, it is no different than organizational theory of what modern day corporations use. The Japanese perfected it to a science after World War II, but it's almost like the structure of a modern corporation. So yes, the modern day gangsters study the old gangsters, and what you have today in the city of Chicago is crime in its ugliest manifestations. Raises an interesting question too about do we glorify the Capone period? Are we glorifying murder? I think that the answer to that is that after a certain amount of time passes, the gore, the crime almost becomes a part of history. Nobody celebrates murder. Nobody celebrates chaos, the destruction of lives, the trafficking of drugs, illegal gambling. But it's funny how Capone has kind of transcended all of that. And there's actually a movement today. There's a guy in Chicago who's trying to promote the good Al Capone. He's doing a documentary on the good Al Capone. He asked me to participate, and I said, no thanks. I said, I write about this period, I'm interested in the period, but in no way am I going to glorify the exploits of Al Capone, because what Capone did in his lasting legacy is he taught future generations how to become criminals. That's the bottom line.
Hold it. Action.
How do you think Al Capone affected Chicago politics and law enforcement?
Chicago politics it's a unique entity unto itself. Capone's influence over the political mechanisms of the city of Chicago were quite profound. He didn't invent it. There was the subordination of politicians long before Capone was active. I wrote a book about a guy named Michael C. McDonald, who laid the foundation of the modern democratic machine back in the 1870s. Mike McDonald was a professional gambler. He understood that to operate his gambling rackets in Chicago, he needed to be able to control the politicians, and by extension, he'd be able to control the police department. He rose to the position of being able to dictate appointments. He elected aldermen favorable to his interests. He actually elected Carter Harrison mayor of Chicago in 1879. That blueprint was already there by the time Capone came into power. Capone was only 20 years old when he came to Chicago in 1919. His uncle James Colosimo had a very lucrative brothel business and a restaurant down in the old South Side Levee, the area around 22nd Street, where for a period of 20 years there was unbridled license, debauchery, gambling, prostitution, you name it. This was a controlled, segregated vice district. Back then, politicians believed, erroneously, that if you can let the criminals operate in a district of Chicago, offering all the vices of prostitution, liquor, etc., presumably it wouldn't spread into the outlying residential areas. That was a very naive assumption. But it was all in place. Capone inherited this because the levee police captain was being paid off by the two aldermen, and the two aldermen were receiving a cut of all the profits coming from the brothels and the gambling in the South Side Levee. So what Capone then took over through his uncle Johnny Torrio, the mechanism was there. It was already in place. He just refined it and brought it to another level. It was said that when he helped elect William Hale Thompson mayor of Chicago in 1927, that he actually had a Chicago mayor on his payroll. And that'll give you an idea of just how powerful some of these criminal elements were. So you had aldermen in Chicago who were part of what they used to call the old river wards, the West Side Block as it was known. And it reached its apex of power about 20 years after Capone was dead. In the 1950s and 60s, these river ward aldermen were actual agents of the Chicago Organized Crime Group, the Outfit. Of course, it's not called the Mafia in Chicago, it's simply called the Outfit. But the control of politicians, the influence, the ability to bribe politicians and by extension dictate appointments to the police department. This is what organized crime does especially good. It's one thing that the street gangs of Chicago today, despite all of their enormous influence they may have in communities, have not been able to do. They have not been able to elect an alderman that we know of that is favorable to their interests. I think it happened one time and it didn't quite work out. But let us hope that that never comes to pass, because good government is essential, and everybody suffers with a political organization that is not on the square, not with the people, and promoting special interests as Capone and his people once did.
Action.
One thing I see in my generation, we see gang leaders passing out Thanksgiving turkeys and back to school supplies, etc. Do you think Al Capone introduced the social aspect of organized crime to Chicago?
Organized criminals and corrupt politicians have always understood the fundamental that to get away with it, you also have to perpetuate the notion that you are with the people. And to become sympathetic with the people, because you never know when the people, you're going to need them to help you out. You take care of them in little ways. You know, you give them a turkey at Christmas time, and as you say, give the kids school supplies when school is starting. This develops sympathy in the community, and the likelihood that people will become informants against a criminal by virtue of doing this is thus minimized. It's an old story that goes back to the days of the paternalistic aldermen in Chicago. There was an alderman in the 19th ward of Chicago called Johnny Powers. They called him Johnny DePow because he was the power of the 19th ward. This was the ward where Jane Addams was trying to create a social movement, the settlement house movement, and bring it to Chicago in the form of Hull House. Jane Addams was a caregiver who was attending to the very weak, unfortunate, and the impoverished people who were moving into the near west side in the 1890s and 1900s. At the same time, she was battling this terribly corrupt alderman known as John Powers, who had been alderman of that ward for over 26 years. He bought his constituents the very same way. He offered them jobs in City Hall. He helped bury them. If they didn't have enough money to bury their dead, he would come forward and help them. He would give them turkeys at Christmas time. So what we're seeing today, the kind of operations the gangs are doing, they didn't invent that. It's an old story. It has gone back decades. It's the paternalistic notion of politics that you can buy your friends very cheaply in many cases.
Action.
Would you advise the new mayor of Chicago to consider the results of the Prohibition era and his or her tactic to fight the extreme violence in our neighborhoods? In other words, should state and city officials think about decriminalizing of drugs to ease the tensions?
Oh boy, that's a tough one. Okay. There's a given, I believe, that you're always going to have crime. The best you can do is minimize it, minimize the devastating social consequences of it. To the question about the legalization of drugs as a way of reducing crime in communities, the idea has been considered. It's not a new idea. Political candidates have sparred over the issue for many, many years. I don't believe personally that drug legalization in itself is going to end crime. If you look in the state of California today, with legalized marijuana to patients who need it for medicinal purposes, you find that these kinds of places are abounding with criminal activity. Scam artists are in the area. There's been a number of holdups at medical clinics that dispense free, legal, or in some cases free marijuana to patients. that's a microcosm, I think, of the larger problems that it would entail. If you look at the